The rain had already turned the sidewalk into a mirror when a patrol car stopped beside her. Red and blue light spilled across the puddles, slicing her reflection into fragments. Aisha Carter slowed, her umbrella tilted back just enough to meet the officer's stare. He didn't step out right away. He watched her first, hand resting on his belt, eyes traveling from her coat to her shoes, as if he were inventorying a threat. "Hey!" he finally called, voice sharp, rehearsed. "Where you headed?" Aisha felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She adjusted the strap of her work bag, conscious of every movement. Downtown offices were empty at this hour. Glass towers loomed like witnesses that would never speak. She answered calmly, gave her address, her job title. He frowned, as though her certainty offended him. The radio crackled. Another cruiser rolled in behind him. "Step to the curb," he said. She complied. Cold concrete seeped through the soles of her shoes as he questioned her again, slower now, as if repetition might change the truth. People passed. Some stared. Most didn't. A phone camera rose, then dropped. "What's the problem, officer?" she asked. He leaned closer, breath carrying the sour edge of coffee. "The problem," he said quietly, "is you don't look like you belong here." The cuffs clicked shut before she could respond. Metal bit into her wrists. Rain slid down her face, indistinguishable from tears she refused to shed. As he guided her toward the car, her phone buzzed once in her pocket, an incoming call she couldn't reach, and the officer froze when the screen lit up with a name that did not fit his assumptions. The rain had thinned to a mist, but the street still glistened when Aisha Carter heard the engine slow behind her. She didn't turn at first. Experience had taught her that sudden movements invited attention. The sound lingered, tires whispering against wet asphalt, matching her pace too closely to be coincidence. "Mississippi." She stopped. A police cruiser idled at the curb. The officer inside leaned out just enough for his badge to catch the light. He was white, mid-30s, jaw set like he'd already decided something important. "Yes," Aisha said. "Mind telling me where you're going?" "Home." "Where's that?" "2 blocks east. Jefferson Towers." He looked past her, as if expecting someone else to answer. "You live there?" "Yes." "What do you do for work?" "I'm a policy analyst." "For who?" She hesitated, then answered. "A nonprofit in D.C." He stepped out of the car. Another cruiser slowed at the corner, its presence quiet but deliberate. "ID." Aisha reached into her bag slowly, holding it open so he could see everything inside. Her fingers brushed her wallet. She handed it over. He studied the card longer than necessary. "You always walk around here this late?" "I worked late." "Doing what?" "Working." His mouth twitched. "You got an attitude." "I'm answering your questions." He handed the ID back, not meeting her eyes. "We've had reports of suspicious activity." "Suspicious how?" He ignored the question. "Step over here." She moved to the curb, cold soaked through the thin soles of her shoes. "Hands where I can see them." "They are." "Don't argue with me." "I'm not arguing." The second officer approached, younger, eyes flicking between them. He didn't speak. "What's the problem?" Aisha asked. The first officer circled her slowly, as if inspecting damage. "The problem is, I don't know what you're doing out here." "I just told you." He stopped in front of her. "You match a description." "Of who?" "Someone who doesn't belong." The words landed heavy, deliberate. A man across the street paused, watching. A woman pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. A phone came up, then disappeared. "Turn around," the officer said. "Why?" "For my safety." She exhaled, then complied. The cuffs snapped shut, metal biting into her wrists. "You're arresting me?" Her voice stayed steady, though her pulse didn't. "You're being detained." "For what charge?" He guided her toward the car. "We'll figure that out." "That's not how it works." "It is tonight." The door opened. She sat, the vinyl seat cold and unforgiving. Rain streaked the window, blurring the street into color and motion. The officer leaned in. "You should have just cooperated," he said. "I did." He shut the door. Inside the cruiser, The radio murmured codes she half recognized. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Once, then again. She shifted, cuffs biting deeper. "Officer," she called. "My phone." He glanced back, annoyed. "What about it?" "It's ringing." "Not my problem." The screen lit up again. The name flashed bright and unmistakable. He froze. "What's that say?" he asked. She met his eyes through the glass. "It says my sister." He opened the door slowly. "What sister?" "The vice president's." The rain kept falling. The precinct smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, the kind of scent that settled into your skin and reminded you that rules existed here, but not always for everyone. Aisha sat on a hard bench, cuffs still snug around her wrists, her coat damp, hair plastered to her neck. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing the room in sterile white that cut to the shadows of corners where officers leaned, whispered, and laughed without care. A clerk glanced at her, bored, tapping a pen against a clipboard. "Name?" "Aisha Carter." "Date of birth?" "January 14th, 1989. She could feel the clerk's gaze lingering just a second too long on her hands, as if he expected her to twitch, run, confess, or vanish. She didn't. She stayed quiet when the second officer entered, carrying a folder that smelled faintly of old paper and authority. "Miss Carter," he said, voice even professional. "You're here because of suspicious behavior reported in the downtown area. We need to verify your story." "Suspicious behavior?" Aisha's voice was calm but sharp, like ice sliding over concrete. "I was walking home from work." He didn't reply. Instead, he motioned for her to follow into the interrogation room. The door closed behind her with a dull thud that felt heavier than metal. The walls were pale gray, blank except for a clock ticking too loudly. "Take a seat." He gestured toward the hard plastic chair opposite him. Aisha obeyed. Her wrists ached from the cuffs. She flexed her fingers once, twice, ignoring the protest from her own body. "You understand why you're here?" he asked. "Yes." "You think I committed a crime simply because of how I look?" His eyes narrowed. "We have to investigate reports." She leaned back, letting the chair scrape against the floor. "Reports? Of what?" "Of walking while black." He ignored the jab. "You were observed in a high theft zone late at night. People find you suspicious." "I was late from work. I have a record of my hours. My employer can confirm it." He scribbled something in the folder. "You were also seen arguing on the phone." "I wasn't arguing. I was scheduling a meeting." The room was silent, except for the scratch of pen on paper. The officer didn't meet her eyes. He didn't need to. He already knew the story he wanted. "Do you have anything to declare?" "I have a right to call my lawyer." "That will have to wait. Internal procedure." Aisha clenched her jaw. She could feel the tension in her shoulders, the slow, simmering anger that refused to break. She was not invisible, not irrelevant. Yet here, in this room, she was treated like neither mattered. The door opened. Another officer stepped in. He was older, with a uniform that had been pressed more than his patience had lasted. "What's the issue here?" he asked, looking at Aisha with polite disinterest, then at the younger officer with silent judgment. The younger officer shifted. "This is unusual. The suspect's ID checks out, but there were complaints." The older officer raised an eyebrow. "Complaints? About what?" "Suspicious behavior." "Be specific." Aisha's hands tightened on her lap. She said nothing, letting the silence push against the air like pressure. The officer sighed, a long release of air that carried years of learned procedure and habitual dismissal. "You can't detain someone indefinitely without evidence," he said finally. "Release her. Document the complaint. Flag it for review." The younger officer's eyes flicked toward Aisha, hesitant. "Should we notify anyone?" "Who? You know, the higher-ups?" Aisha's heart thumped, catching at the tone. "Higher-ups?" she asked. "Procedural. Nothing personal." She nodded slowly, though suspicion prickled at her. Every word here was measured, coded, hiding more than it revealed. When she was finally uncuffed, her wrists raw, she rubbed the imprint of metal into her skin. One officer handed her coat without apology. She folded it over her arm, a shield against the damp chill of a station. Outside the interrogation room, the older officer whispered to the younger, careful to keep his words away from earshot. "You know who she is?" The younger nodded, voice tight. "Yes, that's Aisha Carter, the vice president's sister." Silence, then a sharp inhale. "Keep this quiet. No leaks. No one touches this." Aisha, unaware, walked down the corridor, catching the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant clatter of files. The newsprint smell of the holding area lingered, mingled with the harsh scent of fear. She tried to steady herself, ignoring the murmur of officers, the occasional stare of clerks, the cold gaze of cameras tracking movement. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. One missed call. She ignored it. Another followed. She stopped, heart thudding. It was her assistant. She didn't answer. She didn't want to. Each buzz was a reminder that the world outside the station had continued without her, unaware or unwilling, to stop injustice in its tracks. At last, she reached the exit. Rain fell harder now, soaking her coat, plastering her hair to her cheeks. The city lights reflected in puddles like fractured glass. She breathed deep, tasting the cold, the wet, the lingering bitterness. Someone called her name from the street. A journalist, phone poised, asking questions she didn't yet have answers for. "I'm not commenting," she said, voice firm. No one challenged her. Not yet. The ride home was tense. Cab weaving through slick streets. Every honk, every reflection in the window felt amplified, a reminder that she had walked into a system that didn't see her as herself. Her sister's name had already spread, whispered in precinct offices she hadn't entered. That fact, her connection, her visibility, hung in the air like a blade. When she finally reached her apartment, she sank into the couch, trembling from cold and adrenaline. Rain slid from her hair, puddling at her feet. She stared at the muted television, where news anchors spoke of another routine crime, unaware of the one she had just survived. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she answered. Her assistant's voice was urgent. "Aisha," people are asking. "You need to be careful." They know. Who knows? Precinct. Someone saw. "It's bigger than we thought." Aisha's chest tightened. She had expected harassment. She had expected bias. She had not expected the speed with which her identity could change the game entirely. Outside, the city hummed. Sirens, car horns, the endless pulse of life continuing as if nothing had happened. But she knew differently now. She had stepped into a system where power and prejudice collided, and she had survived. The next steps were unclear, the path dangerous, but one fact was unavoidable. What had started as a routine walk home had just become a public battle she could not ignore. The precinct office smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic tension. Officers moved through narrow corridors with purposeful steps, radios crackling low warnings that only insiders understood. Aisha had been released hours ago, but the ripple of her arrest lingered like smoke, unseen yet undeniable. Inside a small, windowless conference room, the precinct's leadership gathered quietly. A digital clock on the wall ticked methodically as Lieutenant Harris cleared his throat. "We have a situation," he said, eyes scanning the room. "Miss Carter, her identity, her connections," he let the sentence hang, heavy with implication. Sergeant Mills, leaning against a desk, frowned. "Her sister is—" "Vice President's sister," Harris confirmed. "We need to control information. No leaks, not even an internal rumor." Mills rubbed his forehead. "We can't erase what happened. The officer already cuffed her in public. Witnesses, video cameras." Harris's hands clenched. "I don't care about optics yet. Containment first. Get her file. Every detail. Where she was, what was said, any complaints. Double-check body cam footage. Make sure the officers involved stick to the script." The officers exchanged looks. None said it aloud, but each knew what the hierarchy implied. Procedural compliance would no longer protect them. They now faced potential scrutiny that could end careers. Meanwhile, Aisha sat at home, phone in hand, staring at the muted screen of the television. The news had not yet picked up her story. For now, it was quiet, a fragile silence that felt like waiting under a cloud about to break. Her assistant's text came fast and urgent. Precinct knows who you are. Be careful. Don't respond to reporters yet. We need to strategize. Aisha exhaled slowly. The weight of her family name had shifted the narrative before she had any control. She thought of the officer's words. You don't belong here. Suddenly, the scale had flipped. Belonging was now entangled with fear, power, and exposure. Back at the precinct, Harris had convened another meeting. Internal affairs will be notified, he said. No one approaches her directly. This is above us. Keep it quiet. Officer Reynolds, the one who had made the initial report, shifted uneasily. Lieutenant, she wasn't dangerous. Nothing criminal. Nothing criminal, yes, Harris interrupted sharply. But the optics are now political. We handle this quietly. Document every step. No improvisation. No leaks. In the quiet of her apartment, Aisha considered the irony. The officer's assumptions had started the chain of events. Her visibility now dictated its end. The world outside, where her existence had been a simple walk home, had become a calculated stage. Every move, every conversation, every public interaction carried consequence. She remembered the faces outside the precinct. The man with the phone camera, the woman walking past without acknowledgement, the cab driver who avoided eye contact. Each had witnessed her detention. Each had a silent role in her story. And yet, none had understood the layers, her sister, her family, the political gravity hovering over what should have been an ordinary night. Aisha picked up her laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard, drafting a statement. Even a brief one felt like preparing for a trial. She had to account for perception, tone, timing. One misstep could amplify the officer's narrative. Her assistant reminded her again, voice tense through the speakerphone. Aisha, I know you want to speak. Don't. Let us manage. Every word you say can be misused. The precinct is already scrambling, trying to control it. I understand, Aisha replied, though frustration burned under a calm exterior. She sat back, thinking. Her identity had become leverage, her sister's prominence a shield and a target simultaneously. Harris walked the corridor again, checking with clerks, scanning cameras, reviewing logs. Every interaction with personnel was a calculated measure to prevent exposure. He knew leaks could destroy careers, yet each step he took to protect himself only made the officer's initial misjudgment more visible. By evening, the precinct was quiet, but the tension had not lifted. Officers whispered in corners, concerned not for justice, but for the repercussions of association. Somewhere, body cam footage awaited review, stored as evidence yet potent with implication. Aisha, meanwhile, made a decision. She could not remain passive. If the story moved without her voice, it would be manipulated, shaped by assumptions and fear. She drafted notes, a timeline of events, and prepared herself to assert the truth, even if it meant confronting the system that had detained her. The night grew darker outside her apartment window, rain streaking the glass as if the city itself mourned the imbalance of justice. Aisha leaned back in her chair, tracing the contours of her hands, wrists still tender from the cuffs, and reflected on the lessons of the evening. Power was rarely fair. Assumptions could be weaponized, and visibility carried both risk and responsibility. Tomorrow, she would face the world again, but tonight, she steeled herself. She was no longer simply a policy analyst walking home. She was a symbol, whether she wanted it or not, of the intersection of race, power, and justice. And the officers who had misjudged her would soon understand that a name carried weight beyond their prejudice. The morning broke gray, filtered through low clouds and remnants of last night's rain. Aisha sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The city outside seemed oblivious. Taxis weaving through puddles, pedestrians hunched under umbrellas, the world moving as if her arrest had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But for her, nothing could feel smaller than the breach of authority she had endured. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, texts from family, aides, journalists, and concerned friends. Most she ignored, focusing only on the messages from her assistant. Do not engage with media. Not yet. Wait for our strategy. She exhaled, tracing the rim of the cup with her thumb. Even now, she could see how easily the story could be distorted. Suspicious behavior, detained for walking. Those words, casual, anyone else, carried the weight of institutional bias, prejudice codified as procedure. She'd been criminalized for simply existing in a public space, for moving to the city in a body that didn't match the officer's expectations. By mid-morning, fragments of the story began circulating online. Social media posts referenced a late-night arrest of a woman downtown, some speculating a crime, others commenting on procedural enforcement. No context, no accountability, no acknowledgement of the harassment she had suffered. Aisha scrolled to the posts, noting how quickly assumptions took shape, each retelling stripping away her agency. Her assistant's voice came over the phone again, clipped and tense. Aisha, precinct is issuing vague statements. No one's denying the arrest, but they're framing it as routine procedure. Be careful. Nothing you post can be misconstrued. Aisha ran her hands over her face. How long until they try to spin it politically? They've already started, the assistant said. It's subtle, but you'll see. Watch the feeds. Wait, document everything. Hours later, a formal statement appeared on the precinct's website. Words were chosen with the precision of avoidance. An individual was detained for questioning last night in connection with reported suspicious activity. Standard procedures were followed. The individual has been released. Further details cannot be disclosed at this time. No apology, no acknowledgement of error, no humanity. Aisha's phone rang. Her sister. Are you okay? The vice president asked, voice steady but urgent. I'm fine, Aisha replied, though her jaw ached from clenching. I'm more concerned about the narrative. Don't engage publicly, her sister said firmly. Let the team handle it. You need to stay safe. This isn't just about you anymore. Safety. The word felt brittle in her mouth. Her freedom had been stripped for hours, her dignity tested. And yet the world still treated her experience as negligible, something to be smoothed over quietly. By late afternoon, Aisha decided to visit the precinct, not confront, but to gauge the reaction of the institution that had wronged her. The building loomed in the wet haze, its glass and concrete facade indifferent, impersonal. Inside, officers glanced her way, but quickly returned to their routines, avoiding acknowledgement. She met with a clerk at the front desk, who offered minimal assistance, eyes flicking nervously toward the hall. Has anything changed? Aisha asked, voice calm but firm. The clerk shrugged. No comment. Standard procedure. She left, the chill rain soaking her coat, footsteps echoing on the marble steps. Outside, a small crowd had gathered near a newsstand, murmuring about the arrest. She caught snippets. She must have done something wrong. Police said it was suspicious. I heard she's related to someone important. Each fragment was a reminder that her story could be rewritten in seconds. She realized the power imbalance wasn't just in the act of arrest, but in the control of narrative, in the shaping of perception. Back in her apartment, she recorded notes for herself, documenting each interaction, each statement, each tweet and post. She traced the timeline, analyzed the language, predicted where distortions could arise. It was exhausting, meticulous, but necessary. The system that had violated her now depended on secrecy and the manipulation of context. She refused to allow that. Her phone buzzed again, a reporter from a major outlet. The temptation to answer was immediate, visceral. But she forced herself to resist. Every impulse needed to be measured, every word controlled. The story was no longer private. It was now part of the city's consciousness, part of the narrative of who had power and who could be silenced. Late evening arrived with a dull ache in her chest. The precinct's silence contrasted with the city's constant noise. Sirens, horns, distant shouting, the unrelenting hum of life unaware of the injustice carried by its own streets. She thought of the officer who had arrested her, of the casual cruelty in his tone, of the assumptions that guided his actions. Aisha knew this was only the beginning. Public silence would not last. The narrative could shift in any moment, manipulated by reporters, amplified by social media, weaponized by the institution. She understood that visibility was a double-edged sword. It offered potential protection, but also scrutiny, judgment, and attack. And yet, She refused to cower. She drafted a statement internally, unposted, measured, documenting her experience with precision. Her voice, restrained but firm, became her shield. She refused to allow fear to dictate her reaction. The city, the precinct, the officer, they could continue their silence, but she had begun assembling evidence, narrative, and witness accounts. As night settled over the skyline, rain ceasing to fall, she looked out over the streets. Lights reflected in the puddles, fragmented and distorted, a metaphor she could not ignore. Justice, perception, truth. Everything now existed in layers, shifting with perspective. The phone buzzed again. Another news alert, another mention of her name, another reminder that she was no longer anonymous. Aisha gritted her teeth, fingers tightening around the cup. The story had left the precinct, but it had not left her, and she intended to ensure that when it returned, the truth would be unmistakable. Aisha's apartment felt smaller now. Every wall a reminder that the world outside had already begun weighing her decisions. The rain had stopped, but the air remained thick, humid, carrying the scent of asphalt and exhaust into her open windows. She paced the living room, phone in hand, tracking news updates, official statements, and social media chatter. Each post, each fragment of the story, reminded her that the system she had just survived had only been temporarily contained. Her assistant arrived mid-morning, carrying folders and a tablet. "I've compiled everything. Witness statements, news clips, precinct logs, social media screenshots," the assistant said, spreading the materials across the dining table. "We need to anticipate every angle. They'll try to control the narrative. They always do." Aisha nodded, eyes scanning the documents. The officer's report was procedural in tone, clinical, yet it carried coded assumptions. Lines like "appeared nervous and behaved suspiciously" transformed ordinary actions into justification for harassment. She could feel the deliberate subtlety, the way power masqueraded as procedure. "Internal Affairs has started inquiries," her assistant continued. "But the officer has colleagues defending him. He's not alone in this." Aisha's jaw tightened. "Then we prepare for resistance. I won't be silenced by assumptions or hierarchy." Later that day, a call came from her family. Her sister's voice was measured, authoritative. "Aisha, I know you feel capable handling this alone, but this is bigger than harassment. This is institutional. Do not respond publicly until our strategy is finalized." "I understand," Aisha said, though the words fell hollow. She wanted to speak, to assert her truth, but the stakes were higher than personal vindication. Her presence in the narrative had already shifted power, but it was fragile, easily undone by missteps or misinterpretation. By afternoon, pressure mounted from unexpected corners. Journalists called persistently, asking for comment. Activists reached out, offering platforms and support. Even colleagues at her workplace were anxious, worried about exposure or association. Every call required careful consideration. Every interaction weighed against potential consequences. Aisha met with her attorney later, a quiet office smelling faintly of paper and old books. "You were wrongfully detained," the attorney said bluntly, "but the officer and the precinct will resist accountability. They have procedural cover, and the initial report favors their narrative. We must anticipate every tactic." She leaned back in the chair, absorbing the words. The legal system, designed to ensure fairness, had been manipulated by bias, and now the fight would require strategy, patience, and vigilance. Every misstep could reinforce the officer's power. Her phone buzzed again, a social media alert. A clip from a bystander's camera had surfaced online, showing fragments of her arrest. Comments were polarized, some outraged, others attempting to justify the officer's actions. Visibility, she realized, could be both a weapon and a target. The afternoon bled into evening. Aisha sat at her desk, drafting statements, organizing files, and planning the next steps. Her mind raced through contingencies. If the officer lied, if the footage was edited, if public perception shifted. Every variable required control, precision, and foresight. Her assistant, watching her work tirelessly, finally spoke. "You've handled the initial shock well, but know this, pressure will increase. The officer's allies will resist, the system will resist, and the public, They will judge based on incomplete information. I know, Aisha said, but I will not let assumptions dictate the outcome. Not this time. Later that night, the city outside glimmered under streetlights. Rain puddles reflected fractured lights, mirroring the fractured state of truth and justice she now navigated. A siren wailed in the distance, another reminder that the machinery of authority continued its rhythm, indifferent to individual experience. Aisha closed her laptop and stretched, muscles tight from tension. She allowed herself a moment of reflection. The humiliation, the fear, the anger, it was all part of a larger reality she had to face. Justice would not be instantaneous. The officer who had misjudged her remained in place, supported by a system resistant to accountability. Yet, even in that moment of weariness, a small ember of resolve glowed. She would navigate the bureaucracy, the public opinion, and the legal obstacles. She would ensure that the truth, the injustice she had endured, was visible, undeniable, and documented. The night deepened. Aisha stood by the window, gazing at the distant skyline, the city's pulse unrelenting. She knew that in the coming days, the officer would feel scrutiny, the precinct would scramble to contain the fallout, and she would be at the center, navigating every danger with vigilance. For the first time since her arrest, she allowed herself clarity. Visibility was power, but it was also responsibility. The path forward was treacherous, and the system that had wronged her would not relinquish control willingly. But she was prepared to endure, to strategize, and to confront the institution that had misjudged her based on assumptions of race and power. Every decision, every interaction, every statement mattered, and Aisha Carter was no longer just a bystander in her own story. She had become the architect of its next chapter. The leaked footage arrived without warning. A clip, brief and grainy, yet unmistakable. Aisha's hands raised, the officer's hand on his belt, the cuff snapping shut. The video spread across social media like wildfire, retweeted, reposted, dissected. Comments flooded in, some expressing outrage, others trying to rationalize the arrest. Each share carried fragment of truth, fragment of assumption, twisting perception in real time. Aisha watched the clip on her laptop, her stomach tight. Every detail was there. The rain-slicked street, the officer circling her, his words sharp, the presence of bystanders with recording devices. She noted the reactions, shock, murmurs, quiet anger, and realized that public visibility had now outpaced the precinct's attempts at containment. Her assistant sat across the table, scanning the web. It's everywhere. Every news outlet, every social media platform. The narrative is shifting in our favor, but it's chaotic. People see what happened, but they also see you. Everyone will have an opinion. Aisha's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to speak, to clarify, to contextualize. But every word required scrutiny. Misstep, exaggeration, or emotional reaction could be weaponized by those defending the officer. She typed a draft statement, paused, deleted, started again. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, chaos reigned. Lieutenant Harris convened an emergency meeting with department heads. "The footage is public," he said, face tight. "We need to manage damage control immediately. Internal affairs will be scrutinized. Every officer involved must stick to protocol. No one speaks without approval." Sergeant Mills muttered under his breath, but Harris cut him off. "Do not underestimate this. Visibility is our enemy now." The officer thought he could act with impunity. That assumption has ended. Back at home, Aisha reviewed emails from legal counsel. Public pressure was mounting. Activist groups were calling for accountability. Journalists wanted interviews. She understood the stakes. Her safety, the accuracy of the narrative, and the precedent set by her case. She drafted a carefully worded public statement, emphasizing facts, timelines, and the procedural errors, avoiding anger or sensationalism. Her phone buzzed. A reporter from a national outlet was persistent. She answered, voice controlled, deliberate. "I was wrongfully detained. My experience reflects systemic issues in law enforcement. I want accountability, not sensationalism." The clip on social media continued to circulate, each share amplifying scrutiny. Viewers dissected the officer's language, demeanor, and actions. Hashtags began trending, demanding justice, fairness, and transparency. Aisha realized that exposure was a double-edged sword. It forced accountability, but also drew her into public debate she could not control fully. By evening, protests had formed near the precinct. People carried signs, chanted, and demanded answers. Aisha observed from a distance, noting the diversity of the crowd, their energy, their insistence on visibility. The city itself seemed to participate in her story, a collective witness to injustice. Her assistant reminded her, "We must maintain control over messaging. Every interaction, every interview, every social media post must be calculated. This is no longer private." Aisha nodded, absorbing the pressure. She could feel the system's resistance as well. Officers trying to justify, colleagues whispering, bureaucratic structures moving to contain the fallout. The officer who arrested her now faced visibility he could not avoid, yet he remained entrenched in his own narrative, supported by colleagues unwilling to admit wrongdoing. Late that night, Aisha drafted a public op-ed. She outlined the incident factually: the arrest, the officer's assumptions, the procedural errors, the broader patterns of racial bias in law enforcement. Her tone was measured, her words precise. She concluded with a call for systemic accountability, emphasizing reform, transparency, and vigilance. The next morning, her statement went live. Immediate responses flooded in: retweets, news coverage, opinion pieces, and commentary. Each engagement carried both support and scrutiny. Her words were now part of the public record, an anchor for truth in the storm of perception. Inside the precinct, tension was palpable. Lieutenant Harris reviewed media coverage, scribbled notes, and coordinated with higher authorities. The officer who arrested Aisha sat quietly, aware that exposure had shifted power. Where once he could act unchecked, now every move was visible, every action accountable. Aisha, watching the growing wave of public attention, felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Visibility had forced accountability to the forefront, but it also meant the fight was not over. She would continue to document, to strategize, to engage carefully. Every detail mattered: body cam footage, public response, institutional reaction, and legal procedure. By nightfall, Aisha stood at her window, the city sprawling beneath her, lights reflected in puddles, fragmented and shifting. She thought of the officer, the system, the public, and the precarious balance of justice. Exposure had changed the game, but the path ahead remained treacherous. Still, she knew this. Truth, once visible, could not be silenced. And the officer's assumptions, once unchecked, now existed in public scrutiny, with consequences already taking shape. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and anxious energy. Cameras were barred from entry, but the buzz of reporters lingered outside, their presence a reminder that public attention had followed Aisha from the street to the legal system. Inside, the judge presided with a quiet authority, eyes scanning the room as officers, attorneys, and clerks took their places. Aisha sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Her wrists still ached from the cuffs, the memory of cold metal pressing into skin lingering like a faint scar. She glanced at her attorney, who gave a subtle nod. The proceedings were about to begin, and every detail mattered. The officer who had arrested her stood nearby, uniform pressed, posture rigid, the weight of exposure pressing down. He had been removed from active duty pending investigation, but the damage to his reputation and the inevitability of scrutiny had already begun. The prosecutor began, voice steady. "This case concerns the wrongful detention of Ms. Aisha Carter on the night of June 12th. The evidence will show that the arresting officer acted on assumptions, influenced by racial bias, without probable cause or credible evidence." The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. The officer followed protocol as he understood it. Reports indicated suspicious behavior. Suspicious to whom? Aisha's attorney countered. To the assumptions of one man, unchecked, unverified, and applied selectively. There was no criminal activity, no threat, and no basis for detaining Ms. Carter. The officer's actions were guided by bias, not law. Testimony began. Witnesses from the street recounted seeing Aisha's calm demeanor, her compliance, and the unnecessary escalation by the officer. Bystander footage played on the screen, each frame punctuating the disparity between perceived threat and actual behavior. The murmurs of acknowledgement and shock traveled to the courtroom as jurors absorbed the contrast. The officer was called to testify. His voice trembled, defensive yet measured. I was following standard procedures. There were reports. Reports from whom? The prosecutor interrupted. Were they verified? Were they credible? Or were they assumptions rooted in the color of her skin? The officer faltered. His colleagues, called as supporting witnesses, gave cautious statements, some contradicting earlier accounts, highlighting procedural inconsistencies. The systemic patterns became evident. Bias wasn't isolated, but woven into the everyday judgment of officers, protocols that allowed personal prejudice to masquerade as duty. Aisha testified next. Her voice was steady, her words deliberate. I was walking home from work. I followed instructions. I complied, yet I was detained for simply existing in public space. The assumptions made about me were false, harmful, and demeaning. This is not just my story. It reflects a broader reality of systemic bias in law enforcement. The courtroom listened. Each statement, each detail, forced recognition of injustice. The narrative that once favored the officer and the institution began to unravel, replaced by evidence, testimony, and public scrutiny amplified through previous media exposure. Outside, journalists reported in real time, publishing careful summaries of proceedings, highlighting discrepancies in officer statements, and emphasizing the broader implications of case. Social media mirrored the courtroom's revelations, trending hashtags reinforcing calls for accountability and transparency. Days of testimony followed, each one peeling back layers of bias and procedural failure. Analysts and experts discussed patterns of racial profiling, the subtleties of coded language in reports, and institutional structures that perpetuate inequity. The system, once resistant, was now compelled to reckon with its own failures. Finally, the verdict approached. The jury deliberated under the weight of evidence, societal attention, and legal precedent. When they returned, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Every eye fixed on the foreperson as the words were read aloud. The officer's actions were deemed unjustified, influenced by bias, and in violation of civil rights. He faced disciplinary measures, potential criminal charges, and removal from active duty. Aisha exhaled, a mixture of relief and residual tension washing over her. Justice, however, was not unqualified triumph. The officer's accountability came with the acknowledgement of systemic issues, of the broader context that allowed such actions to occur. The emotional cost of the ordeal, the fear, humiliation, and persistent vigilance, could not be undone by a verdict. In the aftermath, the precinct announced internal reforms, procedural reviews, and new guidelines for handling similar incidents. While insufficient in isolation, these changes marked a shift toward accountability and awareness, a recognition that assumptions could no longer substitute for evidence. Aisha returned home, exhausted but resolute. She reflected on the journey, the arrest, the institutional indifference, the public exposure, and the legal proceedings. Each stage had exacted a cost, yet also illuminated the pathway for resistance and systemic scrutiny. Her sister called that evening. "You did what you needed to do," she said. "The system is imperfect, but you may confront its own failures." Aisha nodded, aware that while one officer faced consequences, the structures that allowed him to act remained largely intact. The vigilance required to monitor, expose, and challenge systemic bias was ongoing, demanding continued attention, strategic engagement, and personal resilience. The city outside her window was quiet now, lights reflecting in puddles from earlier rain, fractured and distorted, yet beautiful in its persistence. Aisha allowed herself a moment of reflection. Victory was partial, accountability was complex, but the affirmation of truth, the validation of experience, and the undeniable recognition of injustice were worth the endurance. She knew the struggle would continue, for herself, for others, for the countless unnamed who endured similar violations, but she had set a precedent. Visibility mattered, evidence mattered, resistance mattered, and she had ensured that the officer who misjudged her would never act with impunity again. The night stretched on. Aisha sat at her desk, organizing files for archival purposes, documenting her experience in meticulous detail. Every statement, Every video, every report was preserved, not only for her own clarity, but as a resource for others confronting systemic bias. The work was exhausting, ongoing, but necessary. As she looked out over the city's skyline, she realized that justice had been achieved in measure, but resilience would define the years ahead. Exposure and accountability had shifted power, but the vigilance required to maintain it was hers to sustain. Weeks passed since the verdict. The city's rhythm returned to a semblance of normal. But for Aisha, the echoes of her arrest lingered. Rain-slicked streets, once ordinary, now carried memories of that night. The flashing lights, the officer's judgmental gaze, the cold metal of the cuffs. Each sensation replayed with vivid clarity, a reminder that trauma leaves traces far beyond procedural resolution. Her apartment felt both sanctuary and prison. Inside, files, screenshots, and notes were organized meticulously, evidence of what happened, what could have happened, and what must never be forgotten. She reviewed footage again, hearing in her mind the officer's words, the murmurs of bystanders, the tense silence of the precinct. Each frame was a lesson, a warning, a testament. The media continued to follow her story. Interviews have been selective and deliberate, carefully vetted by legal counsel and her assistant. Every statement reinforced the central truths: wrongful detention, racial bias, procedural failure. She emphasized systemic issues, not personal vendetta, highlighting patterns that extended beyond a single officer or precinct. Public reaction was largely supportive, yet polarized commentary persisted. Some praised her resilience. Others questioned her motives or interpreted her visibility as leverage. She accepted this complexity as part of the landscape she now navigated. At work, Aisha faced subtle scrutiny. Colleagues expressed cautious support, yet some interactions were tinged with apprehension, as though proximity to her ordeal carried risk. She remained professional, engaged, and focused, channeling energy into policy initiatives, research, and advocacy, knowing that tangible contributions to equity could not be overshadowed by public perception. Her sister visited one evening. The two shared a quiet dinner, the conversation flowing cautiously around public scrutiny, media strategy, and family concerns. The vice president's presence was grounding, a reminder of both privilege and responsibility. "You endured something that could have broken anyone," her sister said. "The system failed, but you forced it to acknowledge its failure. That matters." Aisha nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Public justice had been served. Personal resolution was ongoing. The officer faced disciplinary action, reputational damage, and legal consequences. Yet the emotional residue of humiliation and fear could not be quantified. Trauma lingered in flashbacks, in moments of anxiety, in the subtle wariness of routine. In the precinct, reforms had been initiated. Body cam protocols were strengthened, bias awareness training implemented, and internal procedures reviewed. Officers who had offended the initial arrest were monitored, and accountability measures emphasized. Change was incremental, fragile, and incomplete, but it existed. The officer who arrested her now navigated scrutiny he had once assumed he would never face, his authority curtailed by exposure and consequence. Aisha spent evenings documenting her reflections, each entry deliberate, precise. She wrote about fear, resilience, injustice, and resistance. She noted the psychological cost of public exposure, the subtle impact of institutional bias, and the strategies necessary to navigate systems designed to obscure truth. These reflections were both personal and instructive, a roadmap for understanding the interplay between individual action and systemic accountability. Friends and colleagues offered support, yet she maintained boundaries. Visibility had transformed her life, but had also amplified vulnerability. She learned to manage interactions with the public, media, and institution carefully, balancing transparency with protection. Each decision required strategy. Each engagement carried consequence, and each interaction reinforced the stakes of visibility. One evening, she walked along the city streets, the memory of rain-drenched sidewalks from that night vivid in her mind. She paused at a crosswalk, looking at her reflection in a puddle. The contours of her face mirrored the contours of endurance. Eyes alert, posture steady, expression controlled. She acknowledged the weight she carried, trauma, responsibility, visibility, and the resilience she had cultivated. Her phone buzzed, A notification from social media. Comments praised her measured response, her advocacy, her courage. Others debated nuances she had anticipated. She scrolled without distraction, acknowledging the spectrum of engagement but refusing emotional reaction. Visibility remained a tool, not a trap. At home, she joined her assistant in reviewing ongoing advocacy initiatives. Together, they discussed strategies for documenting incidents of systemic bias, amplifying marginalized voices, and creating sustainable platforms for accountability. The work was exhaustive, yet purposeful, a channel for the energy forged in adversity. Aisha reflected on the officer's downfall. Exposure and accountability had shifted power, yet the victory was nuanced. The officer faced consequences, yes, but the broader system remained flawed. She understood that systemic change required persistence beyond individual incidents, requiring vigilance, documentation, and collective engagement. The night settled. Lights from the city reflected in windows and puddles, fractured yet radiant. Aisha sat by the window, pen in hand, reviewing notes. Trauma and resilience, injustice and accountability, fear and empowerment. Each was part of her lived reality, inseparable yet distinct. Her sister's words echoed. You force the system to acknowledge its failure. Aisha allowed herself a quiet acknowledgement of accomplishment, tempered by awareness of the ongoing struggle. Justice had been partial, public, and visible, yet personal healing remained a separate path, one she intended to navigate with precision and care. In the quiet, she made a vow to continue documenting, advocating, and resisting, to ensure that truth remained visible, that bias faced scrutiny, and that systemic change moved forward, however incrementally. The officer's assumptions had been dismantled, but the lessons endured far beyond individual consequence. She placed her pen down, looking at the city skyline one last time that night. Reflection, visibility, and persistence were now her allies. She had endured, witnessed, and strategized. She had survived institutional bias, leveraged visibility, and demanded accountability. The path forward would be long, fraught with challenges, but she was prepared. The city slept, but Aisha Carter remained vigilant, resolute, and unbroken, a testament to resilience, systemic exposure, and enduring struggle for justice. Months passed. The city had largely moved on from headlines, but the precinct had not. Internal reviews revealed procedural failures, bias in decision-making, and a culture that allowed assumptions to dictate action. Officers were retrained, some transferred, others placed under strict oversight. The officer who arrested Aisha faced formal hearings and mounting legal consequences, his career unraveling publicly and privately. Aisha remained vigilant. She tracked every procedural update, every statement issued, every public comment. Her visibility ensured the officer could no longer operate without scrutiny. He attempted to rebuild his reputation quietly, but emails, memos, and investigative reports followed him, leaving no room for unchecked authority. Her daily life was cautiously restored. Work resumed, though interactions were marked by subtle acknowledgement of what had occurred. Some colleagues expressed silent solidarity. Others remained guarded, wary of association. She accepted this as a consequence of challenging systemic structures. Social equilibrium often shifted uncomfortably when truth disrupted institutional assumptions. One afternoon, a legal notice arrived at her apartment. The officer had filed a counterclaim, seeking to defend his actions and challenge the consequences he faced. Aisha read it calmly, noting the language carefully crafted to imply procedural justification while downplaying bias. She responded with her legal team, submitting precise evidence, video footage, witness statements, and institutional records. The process was slow, deliberate, exhausting. Each document, each motion, each hearing required meticulous attention. Aisha's resilience was tested, but experience had honed her patience and strategic thinking. She no longer reacted impulsively. Every step was measured, anticipating the tactics of those seeking to obscure accountability. Outside the courtroom, public attention flickered but persisted. Advocacy groups cited her case as an example of systemic bias, producing reports, policy recommendations, and training modules. Social media engagement remained active, ensuring that procedural outcomes could not erase the broader lessons her experience had illuminated. The officers' hearings revealed more than personal misjudgment. Testimonies highlighted systemic issues. Colleagues who failed to intervene, reports that coded assumptions as suspicion, and institutional structures that allowed bias to influence actions. The proceedings became not only a reckoning for him, but an exposure to the environment that had enabled his behavior. Aisha's family continued to support her, emphasizing careful navigation of public and legal spaces. Her sister's counsel was measured. Accountability is necessary, but don't let personal vindication cloud strategic action. Visibility is your ally, but it must be managed carefully. Aisha took the advice seriously. Every public statement, interview, or commentary was evaluated for its impact on systemic accountability. She sought reform, transparency, and precedent, not retribution. The officer faced personal and professional consequences, but the broader goal remained the cultivation of structural change. At the precinct, officers were aware that their actions were scrutinized in unprecedented ways. Protocols were adjusted, bias awareness training implemented, and reporting requirements expanded. While imperfect, the environment had shifted, and the officer's downfall became a cautionary tale, a visible deterrent to unchecked assumptions. Aisha reflected on the personal cost. Trauma, anxiety, hypervigilance. These were lasting, intangible consequences. She recognized that systemic injustice could never be fully mitigated by a single legal victory. Yet exposure, documentation, and accountability had created meaningful change. The officer's reckoning was both symbolic and practical, a disruption of impunity. One evening, she walked through the city streets, observing subtle changes. Officers interacted differently with citizens. Surveillance and oversight felt more present, procedural rigor more pronounced. She knew systemic bias could reemerge, but incremental change was tangible. Her actions, visibility, and strategic engagement had left marks that could not be erased. At home, she reviewed her notes, reflecting on the trajectory from arrest to public exposure to institutional reckoning. Each phase had required a different skill: resilience, strategy, advocacy, and patience. She recognized that personal endurance and public visibility were inseparable tools in the fight against systemic injustice. Her phone buzzed with a notification from a civic advocacy group. They requested her input on policy recommendations derived from her case. Aisha read the message, considering the opportunity to translate personal experience into systemic change. She responded, detailing insights, evidence, and suggestions for procedural reform. The city skyline stretched beyond her window, fractured reflections of streetlights mirrored in the remnants of recent rain. She acknowledged the complexity. The officer had faced consequences. The system had been scrutinized, yet vigilance remained necessary. Justice was neither absolute nor final, but it was measurable, visible, and actionable. Aisha understood that this was her ongoing responsibility: to maintain documentation, amplify lessons learned, and ensure that systemic accountability continued beyond individual cases. The officer's reckoning was only the beginning, a catalyst for broader institutional reflection and reform. That night, she sat quietly, hands folded, observing the city below. Exposure had brought consequences. Visibility had forced recognition. Strategic engagement had ensured accountability. And through it all, she had endured, adapted, and preserved the integrity of truth. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. The gallery was full, a mix of reporters, activists, and onlookers, all leaning forward, as if the tension could tip the scales. Aisha Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, posture rigid, her hands folded atop the folder containing every detail of the case. Months of waiting, scrutinized footage, interrogations, and public uproar had led here. The officer entered. His usual swagger was gone. The badge that had once granted him authority now felt like a weight around his neck. Colleagues whispered in the hall, eyes flicking to him with a mixture of pity and judgment. The same hands that had cuffed her trembled ever so slightly as he took his seat at the defense table. Judge Reynolds called the court to order. Aisha's lawyer began presenting the evidence. Body cam footage, audio recordings, the officer's repeated disregard for procedure, and the unmistakable racial bias threaded through his actions. Each piece landed like a hammer, echoing through the courtroom. Objection! The defense interjected. Their voice sounded hollow, trying to manufacture doubt where there was none. The judge waved it aside. The evidence was indisputable. Witnesses were called, bystanders who recorded the arrest, colleagues who described the officer's behavior over months, internal affairs officers who testified to the culture of unaccountability he had thrived in. Every testimony added layers to a picture the public had already begun to recognize. The system had enabled abuse, and the officer's arrogance had finally met consequence. Aisha sat quietly as the prosecution rested. Her heart thrummed in her chest. The weight of every insult, every wrongful assumption, and every moment of fear converging into a singular clarity. This was justice, yes, but it was incomplete. It could not erase the night spent sleepless, the public scrutiny, the emotional toll she had carried. When the verdict was read, the officer's face went pale. Guilty, charges upheld, loss of position and permanent suspension. The courtroom murmured, some relieved, others unsettled by the enormity of what had happened and what it revealed about power and prejudice. Outside, reporters clamored, microphones thrust forward. Aisha spoke briefly, measured, her voice calm but unwavering. She emphasized systemic change, accountability, and the courage to confront bias, even when uncomfortable. The applause was muted, careful, recognizing both her personal victory and the broader implications. Walking back to her car, Aisha felt the weight of every moment she had endured. She wasn't unscathed. No one was. But the officer's downfall was tangible proof. The system could bend toward justice, even if slowly, even if reluctantly. She glanced at the city skyline, lights reflecting in puddles. The world had changed in this small corner. For her, for others like her, and for every bystander who had once looked away. Justice had been served, but the reckoning, both public and personal, would continue. The storm had passed, but the air remained charged, a reminder that vigilance was never optional. She held herself taller, chest forward, a quiet defiance etched into her posture. The world had tested her, and she had endured. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future where the mere act of existing in public space did not require constant negotiation, constant justification. The system had fallen short countless times, but today it had failed less than before. As she stepped into her car, the reflection of red and blue lights on the wet street reminded her that accountability was not abstract. It had a face, the officer's face, and though justice had been exacted, she knew the fight against prejudice, against systemic abuse, would continue long after the courtroom emptied. The chapter ended not with closure, but with a quiet resolve. Aisha had survived. She had witnessed the downfall of a man who abused power. She had seen a system bend, however reluctantly, toward justice. And she had learned, in ways nothing else could teach, that resilience was not a choice. It was the only path forward.